A few weeks back, several American troops were killed in Jordan, just across the Syrian border. And in response, the United States government launched some withering attacks, actually a series of attacks on targets throughout the Middle East in an effort to deter and punish those who were responsible for killing American troops. The question we want to raise today is, have those strikes worked? Have the bad guys been deterred? And are our troops now going to be safe in the Middle East? And to do that, we have no one better than former CIA officer Mike DiMino, and a fellow of mine at Defense Priorities. Mike, you've always given us such great views, and you've got some great things to share on this here in a few minutes. But first of all, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Danny. It's good to be on with you. I feel like we've been doing a lot of these lately, and it's been awesome, and appreciate coming on with you.
You bet. We always love to have you on because you got really insights that I don't much hear anywhere else. And one of the hallmarks of our channel at all is that we say, hey, this is the reality. This is what's actually going on the ground, and people can make their own mind up about what any of this stuff means. But as opposed to too many others in a lot of the mainstream media, which have an agenda that they want to try to change the perception of what people may think based on what they want the outcome to be. But we just say what actually is. But before we get into this very important topic here, which is always near and dear to my heart about deployed troops and their safety, I want to touch on something that we talked about a little bit yesterday here on this show and on another one, as it was breaking news at the time when I believe it was the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee issued this really alarming statement that was just on fire on Twitter for a long time because it seemed very serious. He said that today the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence has made available to all members of Congress information concerning a serious national security threat. I am requesting that President Biden declassify all information relating to this threat so that Congress, the administration, and our allies can openly discuss actions necessary to respond to this threat. Now, that makes it sound like something really urgent and imminent. And so, of course, at a White House briefing, the White House spokesman was immediately asked on this question and what's going on. And here's what he said at that time.
Is there anything you can say to characterize what this threat is or what country it involves? I mean, should the public be alarmed at this point since he has said this publicly?
I'm not in a position to say anything further today. Like I said, I look forward to the discussion with him, and obviously from there we will determine how to proceed. But standing here at the podium today, I can't share anything further.
And he went on to basically say, hey, look, this was already a planned meeting. This is not something that's breaking news. You know, I mean, he really kind of dissed on the chairman there, but made it clear, both from his body language and his statement, that he's like, this is a head scratcher. I don't know what he's alarmed about. And of course, as you may know, or maybe you don't, I follow you on Twitter quite a bit. So especially when this stuff's happened, anything that happens related to intelligence, I always go straight to you. And you were skeptical right from the beginning, and we're calling some things out that turned out to be right. So I wonder if you can kind of bring us up to date on what all that was about and what's the current situation.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, for people that don't, I appreciate the plug. Please head over to Twitter, or X as it's called now, and you can find me at MP DiMino. And yeah, I tried to, take a close look at, especially when, intel stories are coming up, and really try to give people, a fair and honest perspective on that stuff. And look, I hate to say I told you so, but I was, as you pointed out, I was on this, from the beginning. And look, this is not some kind of urgent hair on fire, scenario that the U.S. government needs to be issuing panicked 2-second press releases on and sort of causing all of this stir in the media. Look, this is really a situation where the Russians have looked at and explored and considered development of all sorts of programs in space, going back to the Cold War for decades. And if we had a nickel every time the Russians were considering a program like this or looking at doing something kind of kooky in space, I mean, we'd be multimillionaires at this point. So I don't think that the alarmism is really justified. And I think if you really look at what we ended up finding out later in the day, this is under development potentially, and not something that has been deployed, not something that is out there right now that we need to be, losing our hats over. We're talking about either a Russian anti-satellite capability that is nuclear powered or nuclear in its delivery, or we're talking about deployment of possible nuclear weapons to space. But again, these are programs and projects and ideas that are probably years or decades off from any kind of implementation, if they ever are implemented. And that's the thing. I think we can take a reasonable approach here and say, look, this is something we should monitor. This is something that we should counter if need be. But we don't need to be causing this kind of stir up over here for something that is very much what I would call aspirational. And that's how I put it on Twitter yesterday too. And look, the Russians have done stuff like this. I think, or considered doing things like this in the past. But the bigger question to me is the context, right? So this is not really breaking news, especially to people in the IC, that Russia has flirted with these kind of programs. So something that, I tell your audience, and I know you tell them all the time, you've got to ask two questions when this kind of swirl starts to pop up. Who benefits and what is the context? And I would say there's two awfully big pieces of context yesterday that are going around during all of this. One of them is, of course, the effort to get Ukraine assistance over the line in the House of Representatives after it was passed in the Senate. And the second big piece of context is that all of this is happening during perhaps the most fraught effort to reauthorize what are called Section 702 authorizations for the U.S. government to conduct what we call lawful intercept, right? To allow the U.S. government by law to surveil, and work through the FISA system and the FISA courts to conduct intelligence activities. And this program has been renewed many times over the years, but it's actually facing quite a lot of opposition this time. And I think that it's fair to ask if Representative Turner, who is a big supporter of Section 702 and a big supporter of, pushing, kind of maximalist Ukraine aid, is this sort of effort to highlight this problem connected to those two other efforts. And I think it is fair to raise that question, especially when we consider the fact that the kinds of intelligence that we're talking about here that would involve, knowledge on some kind of, Russian technical capabilities, those are probably coming from, and again, I don't know this, I'm speculating, but they oftentimes come from signals intelligence, or SIGINT as we call, which would be, tied to this 702 program. And that's why I think Representative Turner was trying to hold up, this particular piece of intel to say, look, this is why we need to continue to have this program.
And I think actually you and I are on the same wavelength, just on different frequencies here, because in addition to that, which I didn't know anything about, and that makes it even more curious as to the timing and the alarming nature that was issued there, but also the question about hyping up the Russia threat itself. And we had just a couple of days ago Petraeus go on CNN with his own alarming statement like this.
Keep in mind that Russia, first of all, would never stop if they achieve their objectives in Ukraine. Moldova, Lithuania, a NATO member would be next.
Just to put an exclamation point on that, you're saying is they would not stop. This whole, they'd be happy if everyone would negotiate and settle for a couple provinces in the Donbass.
This is complete nonsense. He has never stopped. His goal since taking office increasingly has been to reassemble as much of the former Soviet Union or Russian Empire as he can.
Of course, I could shred that actually militarily if I wanted to, that nonsense, absurd claim that Russia's ready to roll west. But setting that aside, obviously, he's trying to hype big time the Russia threat on CNN, and the anchor's eating it up and just putting some fuel underneath it to make it sound really scary. Then separately, you have the White House, who's been really urgent on trying to get this money broken loose from the Congress to actually send $60 billion more of your tax dollars to Ukraine. President Biden put it like this.
By a margin of 70 to 29 to move forward with the bipartisan national security bill. Now it moves to the House. And I urge Speaker Johnson to bring it to the floor immediately. There's no question that a Senate bill was put on the floor in the House of Representatives, it would pass. It would pass. And the Speaker knows that. So I call on the Speaker to let the full House speak its mind and not allow a minority of most extreme voices in the House to block this bill even from being voted on. even from being voted on. This is a critical act for the House to move. It needs to move. The bill provides urgent funding for Ukraine so it can keep defending itself against Putin's vicious onslaught.
Yeah, boy, that sounds like I'm really again trying to gin up the heat because I want this money. And so then you get this note come out, and all of a sudden, man, it's an alarming thing with Russia. And so we need money to help Ukraine fight Russia. I mean, you see that there's a constituting theme here. What do you think about that combined with what you also said there with your 702 story?
Look, I think that's you said it perfectly, Danny. And I think the last points I'll hit on this issue are right. There's a big difference in the intelligence world between our adversary is doing this or this has already happened, and this is something our adversary may want to do or may one day try to do. And this is very much in that latter bucket. And it just, again, there are hundreds, there are thousands of raw intelligence reports that come in on a daily basis to intelligence analysts all over the US government that have these kinds of claims or data about them. And it doesn't mean that they're not credible or we should ignore them, but it's just not that big a deal. Again, ABC reported yesterday that Russia is actively considering the development of this on-orbit nuclear anti-satellite system, right? This is totally an aspirational thing. And again, just to tie back to the history for folks, Russia, back then the Soviet Union in the 1960s, pursued something called the Fractional Orbital Bombardment System, or FOBS, where they basically wanted to experiment with using low Earth orbit as a delivery mechanism for nuclear warheads, right? To have them sort of ride that trail in space to their targets. And again, did we declassify that in the middle of the Cold War? No, we didn't. Did we have some kind of big public meltdown about it in our media and everything? No, we didn't. So I'm all for transparency in the IC, and I think to your point on what we were discussing about 702, the IC does need to be more transparent about some of those things. But I think in this case, ironically, and people can get mad at me if they want for saying this, I actually think the calls to declassify any kind of really sensitive intel that we might have on this Russian program or Russia considering this program is actually a bad idea. And I think that we could very easily tip off the Russians to our awareness of this program.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's a time and place for transparency, especially when you're talking about policies, but there is definitely a time and place for keeping things secret. I mean, that's why we have a classified system, and I am all about that in the defense of our country. You can't tell everything you know. So I had an issue with that too.
Right. And think about this, right? For people, that may not understand how some of this stuff works, even if you sanitize this intel reporting of sources and methods, right, as we like to say in the intelligence community, but the Russians know that they only stored this information on one computer system, or there was only one human, source, whatever, that had this information. They can very easily go back and conduct a forensic analysis and figure that out. So that's
and it's screwed us. Now we can't get any more info from that source.
Exactly. And I don't, I don't mean to cast aspersions on Representative Turner, but I do have to ask, calling for the declassification of something this sensitive, that really I think is, you could fairly say something that should be, classified, and that the national security, agencies need to be able to, conduct research on and study without, the Russians being aware that we are aware of it. I think it's awfully strange. And that's why, again, I come back to this notion that you raised. Sorry if I sort of did it in a roundabout way, but this does come back to threat inflation about Russia, this panicked approach, where I do think that, getting this Ukraine supplemental over the line, and I think, trying to urge senators and congressmen who, by the way, on both parties now are very skeptical of Section 702 and sort of FISA surveillance writ large, trying to get them to say this is worth it.
Yeah. We'll see how this continues to unfold here. We'll definitely cross that or watch that. And I'm grateful for you bringing that up to hitting our radar here, because I wasn't even tracking that part of it. I had been focused on so many other things here, but that's actually a really important one. In fact, I don't want that to get lost in the shadows of what's going on elsewhere, so that kind of slides in under the radar. I like that you brought it up on the radar. So we'll keep tracking on that. Okay, so I want to shift gears a little bit here to the Middle East, what we talked about at the top of the show. Are our troops safer today than they were before these strikes? Do we have to not worry about them? That's the question we want to go into today. And I want to play a couple of clips here that some people may not be aware of, certainly not in context. Want to get your views on the backside of this, because I know you're really tied into this stuff here in the intel community. So first of all, back in November, when a lot of the issues first started with the spike in attacks on our troops, John Kirby went on one of the networks to say, hey, this is something really important. It's not that they're just out there with targets on their back, like Daniel Davis Deep Top keeps saying. He says, no. There's an active ISIS mission. He put it like this.
These groups and the IRGC, the Supreme Leader, they have a choice to make. We're not looking to escalate, but we absolutely have a viable mission in Iraq and Syria to go after ISIS, which is still a viable threat. And we got to make sure that we have the troops and the capabilities to do that.
Man, we got to have the troops and capability of this very important mission, except that about 4 weeks ago, after the U.S. assassinated a member of the Kataib Hezbollah, who, by the way, and I know I'm going to ask you about this in a minute, that is actually a member of the Iraqi security apparatus, not just somebody, on their own from Iran running around Iraq, but we assassinated him in Baghdad. We did another one here a week or two ago. But after that one, Sadani, the prime minister of Iraq, went on at the World Economic Forum, I believe it was, and was asked about the active ISIS mission. Here's what he said.
ISIS is no longer a threat to the Iraqi people. So there are some cells, some groups running away, hiding away, who have hideout in the desert and they are being tracked by the forces of Iraq. We are a sovereign country, and therefore it is only natural that we move towards this position. This is a request from the people, and this is a democratic country, and therefore we have to reply to meet the needs of the people. And therefore this commission will have to work on the meetings for the withdrawal. Thank you.
So now I wonder if you can expand on that, one of the last things he said there, because first of all, he completely contradicted Kirby and said, yeah, there's no active ISIS mission. We can handle it with our own troops. We don't need your troops anymore. So ergo, our withdrawal won't change the anti-ISIS mission because it's going to continue on with the Iraqi security forces. That's point one. But the second point is I think people are not much aware of, and I wonder if you can expand on the last thing he said is about this commission, which is looking into the withdrawal of the U.S. troops, whether we want to or not.
So, I think to start, Danny, it's important to mention that Sudani, he may have some, political motives, obviously, to say that ISIS is contained. But he really is more or less correct. People in D.C. are going to take issue with that statement that he made, but he's more or less correct. ISIS is contained to parts of the Syrian Badia, sort of the central desert, and in Iraq, remote kind of, Sunni areas out in Anbar and other places. But again, these Shia militias that we keep talking about have a really robust presence throughout the country now. And as we've talked about many times before on your show, they have a very clear interest in going up against ISIS and keeping them down. And so the U.S., for its part, even if we don't maintain a presence in Iraq anymore, like we've discussed previously with over-the-horizon capabilities and other technological abilities that we have unique to the U.S., we can go ahead and keep a lid on ISIS without any kind of physical presence. And I think it is accurate to say that there would not be a significant impact on the counter-ISIS mission if U.S. troops were to leave. The group is just simply a husk of its former self. And look, people get upset when I kind of make this point, people that are very invested in the U.S. staying in Iraq. But let me be really clear for people. Don't take it from me. Please go and find the latest Department of Defense Inspector General report on Operation Inherent Resolve, which is the U.S. counter-ISIS mission in Iraq and Syria. And they just published last week their latest report for the last quarter or so. And there are some really fascinating things in there. For one, they straight up acknowledge, and I'll read from this really briefly, for U.S. forces in Iraq, what are they doing? Here's what they're doing. Key leader engagements were canceled or delayed. Some base operations were degraded, and U.S. advisory support to partners was adjusted due to militia strikes. And again, to translate for people from Pentagonese, adjusted means canceled, closed down, right? So U.S. troops are not actually doing
the things,
the training and advising of local forces and the key leader engagements that they are ostensibly there to do under sort of the John Kirby, view of the world. I would argue that those missions themselves are not that critical to fighting ISIS. They're mostly done in this sort of, rote sort of way that I don't think makes a big impact. But even those,
I conducted those key leader engagements in Iraq. I've physically done them, so I know exactly what you're talking about, and you're absolutely right.
Right, and so these things have a minimal impact, as you said, and then on top of that, we're not even doing them. So I think it's funny when we talk about Iraq, Danny. The foreign policy establishment always tries to put the burden on us for saying, well, do we really need to be there? The burden should be on them to make the case for a indefinite U.S. deployment of thousands of troops to Iraq indefinitely. If they believe that that is important, the burden of proof falls on them, and they have not met that burden. They have not advanced a coherent, logical, consistent argument on why we need to stay in Iraq forever. And as you pointed out with sort of the recent clips and everything, our troops may not be under fire at the moment, given this recent pause we've seen roughly since February 4th in attacks on U.S. troops. But this, I want to be very clear for people, is a tactical pause because these Shia militia groups have the upper hand and they know they have the upper hand. That's why we're seeing this. U.S. troops are going to be attacked at the rate we've seen as long as they are there forever at this point, because we have crossed this line with these Shia militia groups where they know they can go ahead and reach out and touch us as long as we are there. So to sort of circle back to your original question, the U.S. government has started these higher military commission talks, as they're called, with the Iraqi government on what the nature of U.S. presence will look like in Iraq going forward. And this is kind of, again, Pentagon sort of coded language for whether or not the Iraqis are going to let us keep troops there. And these talks are probably going to take a couple of years. But I think the reason we've seen a slight pause in attacks, which I think is very tactical and not some kind of forever thing, is because these Shia militia groups are satisfied that what they're seeing from these talks and their control over Prime Minister Soudani indicates to them that U.S. troops are going to leave probably within 1 to 2 years. And they feel that as long as Soudani, gun to his head, as long as Soudani is going along with what the PMF wants, they don't really need to continue these attacks because the strategic objective for them has been sort of accomplished. But again, I want to be clear with people, and I know it's tough to cover all this nuance in sort of a short period, but I'm going to give it a shot here. Just because Iran doesn't want us in Iraq, or just because these Shia militia groups don't want us in Iraq, doesn't mean that ipso facto we should stay in Iraq forever. Just because they don't want that,
right?
Want the opposite. That doesn't make any sense strategically. And if we made our grand strategy and our foreign policy and our military doctrine based on a sort of third grade view of the world like that, we would be fighting 70, 80, 90 wars at once. And so I just want people to try to understand that. Just because Iran or just because these Shia militias feel like they have the upper hand, again, it more underscores how crazy and fraught these local dynamics are and how useless and kind of insane it is for the United States to try to, feel like it can control all of these little, internecine political struggles. Really, the answer is, Iraq is a total mess. It has been totally taken over by Iran, and keeping U.S. troops there is just asking for ways in which the U.S. can give leverage over to the Iranians to pull us into all sorts of conflicts. So,
and I'll tell you what worries me, Mike, is that if the status quo that exists right now could continue on, then maybe there would be a hope that no more of our troops would be attacked as long as they actually literally are working towards the position of eventual withdrawal. Because I can't imagine that if the Iraqi government actually requires us to leave, that we would also stay in Syria, because I think those are mutually supportive, and they each needs the other. So that would probably be a package deal. But the things probably won't stay static. And I know right now that things are on a knife edge in Israel. And look, all of this, you can't detach the Israeli-Hamas war from whatever Iran does or doesn't want, because a lot of this has been motivated by the killing of large number of Palestinians. If the Israeli Defense Forces eventually say, stick the thumb in the nose, in the face of Biden, and say, we are going to attack on the ground into Rafah, and large numbers of additional Palestinians spike up on top of that, I don't think there's any reason to think that there won't also be another spike on our troops out there. And the problem with that is, aside from the obvious immediate response, the result that more American troops could be killed, but it's then what people want to do on top of that. And we have this really symbolic clip here from General Kellogg. This is what a lot of people are agitating to do.
They have to do what I would call super escalate. They have to take it to a level that everybody's uncomfortable, including those in the Situation Room, where you go to a level you say, okay, this isn't a gamble, it's a risk, and we understand the risks involved. But until we make a clear message, and we send a clear message, these are going to continue. So you have to go outside of your normal box, and you have to break the escalation ladder. Either attack the Quds Force leaders, that's Ismail Ghani, or the Supreme Leader Khamenei, or the facilities they've got in Iran, but somebody has to make a hard call, because now we've reached a point where we're going to have to do something very hard, very strong, and the response is going to be probably, but from their end, it could be proportionate. So be prepared for that.
So right now, people on their side can claim that, okay, that whole list of strikes that we just did, that series of multiple days of strikes, has deterred them. Whether it's a tactical pause or not, they can say, one caused the other. But if there's another spike in attacks and more Americans are killed, I think that the risk of these kinds of thoughts, and I'm sure he will be right back on TV repeating all this, is going to be high, that we escalate into there. So what is your view of what we can do to protect our troops? What is the most effective thing the U.S. can do to protect our troops and not get even more killed by expanding into a huge war?
Well, look, it's sort of funny, General Kellogg is going to make that point and sort of, be very guilty of what I would call context denial, looking at a very similar situation that played out in Afghanistan. And look, the way the Afghan withdrawal was conducted, I was very much against. It was poorly planned. It was done sort of last minute and haphazard. I was in government during that time. It was not a very coordinated effort. So I don't like the way that the Afghan withdrawal was conducted. But I will say this: if you look at what happened in the lead up to the Afghan withdrawal, and when I say lead up, I mean in the 2 or 3 years in advance, the United States government was in negotiations with the Taliban. And it's funny, people think, well, the U.S. government doesn't negotiate with terrorists. Well, we negotiated with the Taliban for 2 or 3 years. Attacks on U.S. troops by the Taliban stopped after those negotiations were substantially underway. And there was an acknowledgement that, look, the U.S. doesn't really have any strategic interest in remaining here. And I do actually commend the Biden administration for recognizing that, even if the way they executed on that was not well done.
Yeah.
The decision. And I think we'll actually see something very similar in Iraq, where if the best way to prevent these attacks from U.S. troops resuming or coming back even worse than they've been, to your point, is actually for the U.S. government to continue these talks with the Iraqi government in good faith. And I don't think that these attacks will continue so long as the Iraqi people and the Iraqi government feel that the U.S. is going ahead and participating in a good faith way. And that will keep the attacks from coming back. And then we'll probably leave Iraq, and people may hem and haw about it. And then a year or two down the line, nobody will even remember that we were there, and nobody will even have any kind of remote awareness of any kind of U.S. interest that has been lost or sacrificed, whatever. And I honestly, I would bring the same question to the people that had meltdowns about the Afghan withdrawal. What exactly has changed vis-a-vis U.S. policy in Afghanistan or threats emanating out of West Asia or Central Asia or anything like that. I mean, we are totally on top of all of those threats, and they're not really significant as far as many of the other threats that we need to be focused on, whether they be China or in Europe or in other places that I think do demand our attention. And that's another point I'll make really quickly, is that there is this idea that the United States just doesn't ever have to compromise anywhere, and that we can do everything everywhere all at once. And I would just say to people that right, and I would just say that that's not really true. And if you look at the amount of bandwidth that's been taken up on Ukraine, or you look up the amount of bandwidth that was taken up even on Afghanistan, I mean, it becomes a huge time suck for our senior leaders. It takes up a huge amount of our national security bandwidth. A point that I like to raise to people is only until about 2021 or 22, there were about 2 or 3 times the amount of people in the intelligence community focused on ISIS than they were on China, right? And are those threats really comparable? I mean, right. that just doesn't make any sense.
It
so
doesn't.
I just want to make the point, and I know it's kind of, I'm kind of going long here, but I just want to make the point that the U.S. does have to make choices. Like any other country on the planet, no matter how strong and powerful we are, we do have limited resources. We do have limited bandwidth. We have a defense budget. We have, some limitations on how we spend our time and money. And we have to react to that reality by making good choices and making good picks on what our priorities should be. And Afghanistan is just not a significant strategic priority for the United States, and neither is Iraq. So I think the short answer is the best way to stop U.S. Troops from continuing to be under fire is to continue these higher military commission talks and work out with the Iraqi government a way that we can ultimately, adjust our posture there going forward.
Yeah, that's the best way. And I saw in I believe it was a Bloomberg op-ed maybe 2 days ago, the author made a great point that I think deserves some commentary here right at the end. Is it really along the lines of what you're talking about, the intel community, using so much resources on something that's of relative, actually significantly less important than these other geostrategic issues like in China. Manpower is the same issue. There are 46,000 U.S. troops in the Middle East. I don't know what they're there to help us do, but that means that they're not available anywhere else. And we have to spend enormous resources to keep them just maintained on a daily basis, protected. And of course, with this, the risk that we could actually, that be the cause of expanding into a war that has no value to our country whatsoever. So every way you want to look, we benefit. We are stronger and more secure if we move in that direction. And I certainly hope we do. Mike, thanks for coming on and joining us today and giving these great insights. We're going to continue to track these issues, especially with the 702. I'd like you to come back on and, let us know how that thing shakes out. And then all these issues here too. So we're grateful for you. Look forward to coming back. But and appreciate you guys watching us today. We ask that you like and subscribe. We are going to continue to be unintimidated and uncompromised, bringing you information just like this you won't get anywhere else. And in fact, we got some more for you this afternoon at 1 o'clock. We have Jason Beardsley coming back on, a favorite on this channel, former Green Beret. Man, is he tied into what's going on the ground. It has also some great insights. You won't want to miss that. Join us at 1 p.m. for that. Thanks, and we will see you next time on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.